"Mom, starting with your next paycheck, we're transferring all your money to my account." Those were the words my son, Bryce, spoke to me that Thursday afternoon while we were drinking coffee in my kitchen. He said it like it was the most normal thing in the world, like he was doing me a favor, as if I were totally incapable of managing my own money at 62 years old. I just stared at him, completely dumbfounded. I didn't say anything for a few seconds, just searched his eyes, trying to find some kind of explanation. Why would my own son, the boy I raised all by myself, the man I fed with the sweat of my brow, be asking for complete and total access to my bank account? But I found nothing, absolutely nothing. All I saw was that calm smile, that self-assuredness of someone who knows they have all the control. So I took a deep breath and I told him yes, that it seemed fine, that I trusted him completely. Bryce's smile got even bigger. He stood up, gave me a quick mechanical kiss on the forehead, one of those kisses that just don't mean anything, and told me it was for the best. He said I wouldn't have to worry about a thing, that he'd take care of everything for me, that it was all for my own good. Those words, "for my own good," just seemed to hang in the air long after he'd left my house. That very evening, like clockwork, just like every Friday, Bryce came back, but not alone. He brought his wife just like he always did. He showed up expecting me to have dinner ready, the table all set, hot free food waiting for them, just like it had been every single Friday for the past 3 years. I heard them pull up. I heard their footsteps coming up to the entrance. I heard the key I'd given him turning in the lock. I heard the door swing open, and then I heard the scream. It was a high-pitched, desperate sound. The scream of someone who had just seen something they never, ever expected to see. The cry of someone realizing that things weren't going to go the way they thought they would. I just stayed put in my chair in the empty kitchen, in the empty house, listening to that scream echo against the walls. I didn't move an inch. I didn't go to see what was happening. I already knew exactly what was happening. Bryce rushed into the kitchen. His face was white as a sheet, his eyes wide open. His wife followed right behind him with the same expression of complete shock and disbelief. "Mom!" Bryce yelled. "Mom, what did you do? Where is everything? Where's all the furniture? Where's the TV? Where's everything that was here?" I looked at him calmly, with a self-possession I didn't even know I possessed. I told him in the softest voice I could muster that I had sold a few things, that I needed the cash. After all, if he was going to be in charge of my finances, I needed to make sure I had some money on hand first. His face went from pale to red with pure fury. He took a step toward me, and for the first time in my life I saw my son for who he really was. Not the boy I had raised, not the young man I had helped build his life, but a complete stranger, someone who looked at me with contempt, with rage, with something that dangerously resembled hate. "You're crazy," he snapped. "You are completely out of your mind. How could you sell things without even asking me? How are we supposed to watch TV when we come over? How are we going to be comfortable here?" That last sentence just changed everything. How are we going to be comfortable here? Not how are you going to be comfortable, Mom? He wasn't worried about how this affected me, but about how they would be comfortable, as if my house were just an extension of theirs. As if my possessions existed solely for their convenience. His wife stepped closer. She looked at me with those eyes that always seemed so cold and calculating and said something I will never ever forget. She said I was being selfish, that I was only thinking about myself, that they came every week to keep me company, to make sure I was doing okay, and this was how I repaid them. Selfish? Me? The woman who had worked double shifts for years so Bryce could go to college? The woman who had given up on rebuilding her life after his father abandoned us, because she didn't want her son to grow up with a stepfather? The woman who had lived in small apartments, worn old clothes, and eaten the bare minimum so he could have everything he needed? Selfish. Bryce just stood there looking at me like I was some kind of problem he needed to solve. And then he said something that broke me in two. He said maybe it had been a mistake to suggest the bank account transfer, that maybe I wasn't in any condition to make good decisions, that perhaps I needed more help than he thought. More help? As if I were some kind of burden, some incapable elderly woman who needed to be controlled. I stood up from my chair. I looked at both of them and told them in a voice that came out louder than I expected that dinner wasn't ready, that there was no dinner, and that if they were hungry, they could go eat somewhere else. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Bryce just stared at me like he couldn't believe what he had just heard. His wife let out a dry, bitter laugh and mumbled something about respect and gratitude. And then Bryce spoke the final line, the one I still hear in my head when I close my eyes at night. He said with a coldness I'd never known him to possess, that I should be careful. A woman my age, alone without family who truly cared about her, could end up in a bad way. He said he was the only thing I had, and I should remember that before doing anything stupid. They left. They stormed out of my house, slamming doors, leaving a trail of rage and veiled threats in their wake. I heard them get into the car, heard the engine start, and listened as they drove away. I stood there in my empty kitchen, in my empty house, feeling something inside me permanently shatter. But it wasn't sadness I felt. It wasn't desperation. It was something different entirely. It was clarity. It was the absolute certainty that my son didn't love me, that perhaps he never had, that I was just a resource to him, a source of money, food, and convenience. I sat back down in my chair. I looked at the bare walls of my living room. I looked at the empty spaces where furniture I'd bought with my own hard work and effort once stood. And for the first time in a very long time I smiled because Bryce didn't know something. He didn't know I hadn't sold the furniture for money. I had sold it to send a message to see how he would react, to confirm what I already suspected deep down in my heart. And he had reacted exactly as I expected, with rage, with indignation, with the attitude of someone who feels entitled to another person's things. That night, as I sat in the darkness of my empty house, I made a decision. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to do something much more powerful. I was going to observe. I was going to wait. I was going to let Bryce believe he had one. And then when he least expected it, when he was most confident, most sure of his control over me, I was going to show him who Eleanor Ellie Johnson truly was. Not the submissive mother he thought he knew, but the woman who had survived a broken marriage, poverty, and grueling hard work. The woman who knew exactly how to protect herself. The woman he should never have underestimated. There was a time when I believed being a mother was enough, that the love I gave would be naturally returned, as if it were some kind of universal law that the sacrifices I made every single day would build something solid, something unbreakable between my son and me. How incredibly wrong I was. Bryce was born on a stormy night 34 years ago. His father, the man who had promised me a life together, left when the boy was barely 2 years old. He said he wasn't ready to be a dad, that he needed to find himself, and that I would understand someday. I never understood, but I also didn't wait around for him to come back. I was left all alone with a small child, a 2-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, and a secretarial job that paid $800 a month. It wasn't enough, not even close. It was never enough. So, I got a second job cleaning offices at night. I would leave Bryce with my neighbor, Mrs. Bertha Washington, an older lady who charged me $50 a week to watch him. I worked from 7 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening at the office. I'd come home, feed Bryce, bathe him, put him to bed, and then head out again at 9 o'clock at night to clean buildings until 2 o'clock in the morning. I slept for maybe 4 hours and then started all over again. I did this for years, so many years that I lost count. I remember Bryce always wanted the brand name sneakers that all the other kids at school wore. They cost $100. I earned maybe $1,200 a month between both jobs. $100 was almost all the money I had for groceries for 2 weeks, but I bought them for him anyway. I didn't want my son to feel like he was less than anyone else. I wanted him to know that his mother would do anything for him, absolutely anything. I ate rice and beans for an entire month just to pay for those sneakers. When Bryce turned 18, he wanted to go to a private college that cost $10,000 a year. I didn't have that kind of money. I didn't even have a tenth of that kind of money. But I went to the bank and took out a loan. I went into debt for 4 full years of his education, which I ended up paying off over 10 long years. 10 years of paying off a loan so my son could have a college degree. He graduated and got a good job. He earned $6,000 a month, double what I made after 30 years of working. And I was happy, genuinely happy. I thought he could finally start building his own life. I thought I had finally done my job as a mother well. But Bryce didn't move out right away. He said he wanted to save money, that he wanted to have a solid foundation before becoming independent. I told him, "Of course, this is your home. You can stay as long as you need." He stayed for 5 more years. 5 years where I kept working both of my jobs. 5 years where I paid the rent, bought the food, and covered all the utilities. 5 years where Bryce saved every single penny of his salary because he didn't have to pay for anything. When he finally left, it wasn't to rent an apartment. It was to buy a house. A $300,000 house that he paid for in cash because he had saved all his money during those 5 years of living for free in my home. I was proud, genuinely proud. I told him I was proud, and I really was. I thought I had done a good job helping him. I thought that now that he had his own house, maybe he could help me out a little, maybe I could work less, maybe I could finally rest a little. But that never happened, not even once. Bryce got married 2 years after moving out. His wife was a very elegant woman, one of those who always dressed well, always had perfectly manicured nails, and always spoke in a tone that sounded polite, but hid a certain coldness. I noticed from the start that she looked at me differently, as if I were somehow inferior, as if she didn't understand why Bryce came from where he came from. At the wedding, which cost $30,000, I sat at a back table, not at the head table with the family. Bryce explained that it was because there were a lot of important people, clients from his work, and they needed those tables for them. I said I understood. I smiled in the photos, danced when asked, and went home alone that night, feeling strangely empty inside. After the wedding, Bryce's visits became less and less frequent. Before, he came to see me 2 or 3 times a week. After he got married, he came once every 2 weeks, then once a month, always in a rush, always looking at his phone, always with some excuse to leave early. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the heavy mother, the complaining mother, the mother who didn't understand that her son had his own life now. But then they started coming on Friday nights, always around dinner time, always unannounced, always expecting me to have food ready. First, I was delighted. I thought Bryce finally wanted to spend time with me, that he finally missed me. So I cooked all of his favorite dishes, set the table nicely, and bought dessert. But then I noticed something. I noticed that Bryce never came alone. He always brought his wife. And I noticed they never came to chat or visit. They came to eat. They arrived, sat down, ate, and left. Sometimes they stayed for an hour, sometimes even less. I also noticed he never brought anything, not even once. Never a bottle of wine, never a dessert, never any money to help with the food, nothing. One night after they left, I calculated how much I had spent on the dinner. $15. Money I really didn't have to spare. $15 meant I would have to work extra hours to make up for it. And then I realized something. I realized that for Bryce I had become a service, a free restaurant, a place where he could come to eat without paying, without even truly saying thank you. I began to notice other things too. I noticed that when I asked him for help with something, he always had an excuse. When I needed him to take me to the doctor because my car was broken, he was always too busy. When I mentioned that my refrigerator was making strange noises and I was afraid it would break soon, he told me to buy a new one, as if I had $500 saved up for emergencies. I didn't. I barely had enough to make it to the end of the month. But the worst was my birthday, my 60th birthday. Bryce arrived 2 hours late with no gift, no card, and some flimsy excuse about traffic. He stayed for 20 minutes. He ate the cake I had bought for myself because I didn't want to spend the day alone. And then he left. I cried that night. I cried like I hadn't cried in years because I finally understood something I had been denying for way too long. I understood that, to my son, I was no longer important. I was just a resource, something that was just there, available, waiting to be used whenever he needed it. And the worst part was that I had allowed it to happen. I had set that pattern. I had never asked him for anything. I had never told him that I felt used. I had never told him that I needed more from him than just 20-minute visits and Friday night dinners. I was afraid. I was afraid that if I complained, if I asked, if I demanded anything, he would disappear completely. And the idea of losing my son, even this son who barely even saw me, terrified me more than anything else in the world. So I continued being the convenient mother, the silent mother, the mother who was always there, who always had the door open, who never caused any trouble until that Thursday afternoon, until Bryce told me he wanted to manage my money. Something inside me, something that had been dormant for years, finally woke up. A small but clear voice that told me this wasn't right, that this was the beginning of something much worse. But even then, even with that voice whispering in my head, I told him yes. Because I still had hope. I still wanted to believe that my son loved me, that he would protect me, that he would do the right thing. How completely foolish I was. The following Monday, Bryce came to my house with papers, lots and lots of papers. He spread them out on the kitchen table with that smile that now seemed different, less warm, more calculated. "Mom, this is all really simple," he said. "I just need you to sign here, here and here. These are just the documents so I can have access to your account, so I can automatically transfer your salary every month. That way I can take care of paying your bills, managing everything. You won't have to worry about a single thing." I looked at the papers. They were bank forms, authorization forms. I read the fine print, the parts that people usually just ignore, and I saw something that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just access to my account. It was full power of attorney. It was the authority to make transfers, to close accounts, to make financial decisions on my behalf. "Bryce, this says you'd have total control over my money," I told him. He nodded as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Yes, Mom. It's just easier that way. That way, I can handle everything without having to ask you for authorization every single time. It's just for practicality." Practicality? That word just echoed in my head. Practicality for whom? I wondered, but I didn't say it out loud. I picked up the pen he offered me. I held it in my hand, and for a moment I was about to sign. I was about to give him everything because that's what I had always done. Trust, surrender, believe. But then I remembered Friday night. I remembered his face, contorted in fury when he saw the empty house. I remembered his words. I remembered how he had threatened me, even though he probably didn't even realize it was a threat. I put the pen back down on the table. "You know what, Bryce? Give me a few days to think about it. I want to read everything over calmly. I want to be absolutely sure." His expression changed for just a split second. A flash of irritation crossed his face before he smiled again. "Mom, there's really nothing to think about. It's all very simple. But okay, if you want to take a few days, that's fine." He left then, but he left all the papers behind as if he was assuming I would eventually sign them anyway. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed up looking at those papers on the kitchen table, and something inside me told me that this wasn't for my own good. That this was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to reverse once it started. The next day I went to the bank. I went early before my job. I asked the teller to review my account, to show me all the transactions for the last 6 months. She printed out the papers. They were several pages long. I reviewed them carefully line by line, and then I saw it. I saw it, and I felt like the floor just moved beneath my feet. There was a withdrawal that I hadn't made. A withdrawal of $1,200 from 3 months ago. $1,200 that had left my account, and I had absolutely no memory of taking it out. I asked the teller if she could see any more details. She checked her computer and told me something that took my breath away. She said the withdrawal had been made at a branch across town using my debit card, but I had never even been to that branch, and my card was right there in my wallet. It had always been in my wallet except for one time. I remembered then. I remembered that 3 months ago, Bryce had come to visit. I was in the shower when he arrived. I yelled for him to come on in, that the door was unlocked. When I came out, he was waiting for me in the living room. We sat down to chat, and at some point I went to the kitchen to make coffee. My wallet was in my purse. My purse was in the living room with Bryce. I felt nauseous. I felt like the whole world was tilting strangely because this could only mean one thing. It meant my son had taken my card, memorized or photographed the numbers, and withdrawn money from my account without my permission. I asked the teller if there was any way to know exactly what had happened with that withdrawal. She told me I needed to file a formal claim that the bank would investigate, which could take several weeks. I told her I'd think about it, and I left the bank feeling like I no longer knew my own son. But I didn't file the claim, not yet, because I needed to be sure. I needed to know if this had just been a one-time thing or if there was more. I spent the next few days checking everything, every single piece of paper I had in my house, every document, every old bank statement I had kept in a box in my closet. And I found even more things. I found that 2 years ago, when I was in the hospital with pneumonia, someone had used my health insurance for consultations I hadn't made, appointments at clinics I didn't even know existed, consultations that had exhausted my annual coverage, which was why I had had to pay out of pocket for some medications that year. I also found a credit card in my name that I didn't even remember applying for. A card with a balance of $3,000. $3,000 in purchases I hadn't made at stores I had never even been to. I called the credit card bank. I asked them when the account had been opened. They told me 18 months ago. I asked if they could tell me where the purchases had been made. They gave me a list. Hardware stores, electronics shops, home furnishing stores. Bryce had bought a house 2 years ago. Bryce had renovated that house, and apparently Bryce had used my credit to do it. I sat on the floor of my room, surrounded by papers, feeling everything I had believed about my life just crumble. It wasn't just about the money. It was the betrayal. It was knowing that my son had been robbing me for years, that he had viewed me as an unlimited resource, that he had never intended to care for or protect me. I cried until I had no tears left. Then I wiped my face, gathered all the papers together, and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him yet. I wasn't going to yell or accuse him because I knew if I did, he would deny everything. He'd say I was confused. He'd say I was starting to lose it. He'd say anything to make me doubt my own memory, my own sanity. No, I was going to be smarter than that. I was going to gather evidence. I was going to document everything. I was going to build a case so solid that he couldn't deny it. And then, only then, would I act. On Friday of that week, Bryce came back as always at dinner time, as always expecting me to have food ready. But this time I had cooked differently. I had made his favorite dish, chicken and rice. The very same meal I used to make when he was a little boy and came home sad from school. The dish that told him how much I loved him without me even needing to say the words. He sat at the table with his wife. They ate and talked about superficial things. Work, the weather, the new movie they wanted to see. I watched them, really watched them like I was seeing them for the very first time. And then it hit me. Bryce ate my food with the same lack of interest he'd show to a burger from a drive-thru. No gratitude, no appreciation, just mechanically shoveling in something that was free. When they were done eating, Bryce whips out those bank papers again. Plunked them right down on the table, next to his empty plate. Mom, the days you asked for are up. You've thought this over, right? Just sign here and I'll handle everything. I looked him right in the eye, and in the calmest voice I could manage, I told him that I still wasn't sure and that I needed more time. His wife actually scoffed. Ellie, this is just ridiculous. Bryce is only trying to help you. I just don't understand why you're so distrustful. Distrustful? That's what she called me. And the really sad part was she was right, but for all the wrong reasons. Bryce stood up, his smile gone, replaced by a hard expression. Mom, this is for your own good. You can't manage your finances by yourself anymore. It's obvious. Look at how you sold the furniture without even thinking about it. Look at these irrational decisions you're making. Irrational. Selling my own furniture in my own house was irrational, but ripping me off for years wasn't? I didn't say a word. I just kept staring at him until he looked away. They left that night without even saying goodbye. And I stayed there sitting at my kitchen table, staring at those unsigned papers, knowing that the real battle had just begun. A silent war, a war I had to win because if I lost it wouldn't just be my money I'd lose. It would be my dignity, my independence, my very life. The days after that dinner were weird. Bryce didn't call, didn't visit. It was like he had decided to punish me with his absence. Like he thought I'd crack without him. That I'd come crawling back and beg him to come back, and that I'd finally sign those papers just to get his attention again. But I didn't crack. For the first time in years, the silence in my house didn't feel empty. It felt like it was full of something new, something like clarity. I spent those days going over every little detail of my financial life, every receipt I'd ever saved, every bank statement, every piece of paper that had anything to do with money. And the more I looked, the more I found. I discovered that 3 years ago, when Bryce had asked to borrow my ID because he said he'd lost his and needed it to pick up some important package, he'd done more than that. He'd opened a utility account in my name at an address that wasn't mine, his house. For 3 whole years, the electricity bill for Bryce's house had been in my name. And when he didn't pay on time, the late fees piled up and dinged my credit score. That was why I'd been turned down for a small loan last year when my car needed repairs. That was why my credit score had mysteriously dropped. I called the utility company and explained that the account wasn't mine, that I'd never lived at that address. The woman on the phone told me that I needed to file an affidavit, that I had to report it as identity fraud. Identity fraud committed by my own son. I hung up the phone and just stared at the wall for a long time, trying to figure out how things had gotten to this point, trying to understand when my son had turned into this person. I couldn't sleep that night. I just laid there staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside. And I thought about all the times I had excused his behavior, all the times I had told myself that he was busy, that he had his own life, that I was being demanding by expecting more from him. But this wasn't about expectations. This was about stealing, about lying, about a son who saw his mother as some kind of cash machine he could just use without any consequences. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. I went to see a lawyer. It was a small office downtown. The sign said David Chung. I'd seen an ad for him in the paper offering free consultations. I walked in feeling small and ridiculous, a 62-year-old woman coming in to complain about her own son. But the receptionist smiled kindly and showed me in. David Chung was a man in his 50s, with graying hair at the temples and kind eyes. He asked me to tell him everything, and so I did. I told him about the missing money, the credit card I hadn't applied for, the utility account, the papers Bryce wanted me to sign. He listened without interrupting, taking notes on a notepad. When I was finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Mrs. Johnson, what you're describing is financial fraud and abuse of trust. If you sign those papers your son wants you to, you're giving him total legal access to your money. He could empty everything out, and you wouldn't have any legal recourse because you gave him permission." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I knew it deep down. I knew it, but hearing it said out loud by a professional made it real in a completely different way. "What can I do?" I asked him. He leaned forward. "First, don't sign anything. Second, you need to report the credit card fraud and the theft from your bank account. Third, you need to change all your passwords, your PINs, everything. Fourth, consider getting a restraining order if you feel you are in danger." A restraining order against my own son? The idea seemed absurd and heartbreaking at the same time. "I don't want to get him into legal trouble," I said. "He's my son." The lawyer looked at me with what seemed like a mixture of compassion and sadness. "Mrs. Johnson, your son is already in legal trouble. He's committed several felonies. The question isn't whether you want to get him into trouble. The question is whether you want to protect yourself." I left that office with a folder full of forms and a list of things I needed to do. I felt overwhelmed, but I also felt something else. I felt determined. I went straight to the bank. I changed all my passwords, asked for a new debit card, closed the fraudulent credit card, and filed a formal dispute. The teller helped me with everything, treating me with patience and without making me feel stupid or weak. When I got home that afternoon, I felt exhausted, but also strangely light, as if I'd been carrying around some invisible weight for years, and it had finally been lifted. That night, Bryce finally called. His voice sounded strained on the phone. "Mom, we need to talk. Come to my house for dinner tomorrow. We have to resolve this." It wasn't an invitation. It was an order. And before I would have just obeyed, no questions asked. But now, after everything I had discovered, I felt only a cold calm. I can't tomorrow, I told him. I'm busy. Busy? Mom, what could you possibly be busy with? What I'm busy with is important to me, I said. There are other things that matter more to me now. There was silence on the other end of the line. A silence that felt heavy with surprise and irritation. You're acting really weird, Mom. I don't know what's wrong with you, but you need to stop being so stubborn and sign those papers. This is for your own good. For my own good? Those words again, as if robbing me was an act of love. Bryce, I said, my voice coming out firmer than I expected. I am not signing anything, and I think we need to have a very serious conversation about a few things. About what things? He asked, his voice sounding different now, more alert, more cautious. About money that has left my account without my permission. About credit cards I didn't apply for. About utility accounts in my name at addresses where I don't live. The silence that followed was absolute. So thick I could almost feel it through the phone. I don't know what you're talking about, he finally said. His voice sounded controlled, but I could hear the panic underneath. I think you do know, I told him. And I think you need to think very carefully about what you're going to say next. Mom, you're delusional. You're confused. Maybe you need to see a doctor. There it was, the card I knew he would play, the "you're senile, confused, and incapable" card. I'm not confused, Bryce. I have all the papers. I have all the evidence, and I've already spoken with a lawyer. Another silence, this one longer, heavier. You talked to a lawyer? His voice was almost a whisper now, almost a threat. Yes. And he explained to me exactly what you've been doing. He explained what fraud is. He explained what is illegal. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your son. Everything I've done has been to help you. Help me, Bryce? You've been robbing me for years. You've used me. You've lied to me. I never, he started to say, but I cut him off. Yes, you did. And you know it. The question now is what we're going to do about it. I heard his breathing on the other end of the line, heavy, ragged. I'm coming over, he said. We need to talk in person. No, I told him. You are not coming here. If you want to talk, we can do it over the phone, or we can do it with lawyers present. Are you crazy? He yelled. Completely crazy. After everything I've done for you, after all the times I've come to see you, that I've worried about you, this is how you repay me? All the times you came to eat for free, you mean? All the times you needed something from me? But the times I needed you, where were you? I hung up then, before he could answer, before he could manipulate me again with his words. I stayed sitting at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand, trembling, but not from fear, from rage, from years and years of suppressed rage that was finally finding its voice. I slept better that night than I had in months, because I had finally spoken the truth. I had finally defended my territory, and although I didn't know what would happen next, I knew that I was no longer going to be the silent mother who allowed herself to be trampled on. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. It was like a thick fog had lifted from my mind, and now I could see everything with an almost painful sharpness. I knew what I had to do. I knew I couldn't stop now. After breakfast, I grabbed my purse and left the house. I had a mental list of all the places I needed to go, all the loose ends I needed to tie up. If Bryce thought I was some confused, helpless old woman, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. My first stop was the main bank where I kept my savings account, not the checking account where I got my paycheck, but the other one, the one I'd opened 30 years ago when I still had dreams of buying a house of my own someday. I had $20,000 saved there. It wasn't much after a lifetime of work, but it was mine. I asked the manager to close the account. She asked if I was sure if there was a problem. I told her I just wanted to make some changes. She gave me the money in a cashier's check, and suggested that I open an account at another bank for greater security. I followed her advice. I went to a different bank, one across town, one where Bryce had never been with me. I opened a new account, an account only I knew about, an account where he could never find my money. Then I went to the utility company. I presented all the documents that Mr. Chung had helped me prepare. The affidavit, a copy of my ID, proof that I had never lived at the address where the account was registered. The woman who helped me checked everything and told me that they would start an investigation, that the account would be transferred to the correct name or closed, and that I would no longer be responsible. I felt like an invisible chain had been lifted off my shoulders. My next stop was the credit bureau. I asked for a full report of my credit history. I wanted to see everything. I wanted to know if there were more things Bryce had done behind my back. The employee gave me a thick document. I sat in the waiting room and read it page by page. And there it was, another thing I didn't know about. A personal loan of $5,000 applied for in my name 2 years ago. A loan that had never been fully paid and was now in collections. $5,000. I felt the rage rise up my throat again like bile. I marked every fraudulent item with a highlighter. I filled out the dispute forms one by one with clear, firm handwriting. When I left that office, it was almost 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast, but I wasn't hungry. I had something stronger than hunger. I had purpose. I then went to the house of my neighbor, Mrs. Bertha Washington. She was 70 years old and had lived in the building since before I did. We had been friends for decades, although we had grown distant over the last few years. I had been so focused on Bryce, so consumed with trying to maintain that relationship, that I had neglected other connections. I knocked on her door. She opened it with a surprised look on her face. "Ellie, what a surprise. Come in, come in." We went into her living room. She offered me coffee and I accepted. We sat down, and she looked at me with those wise eyes that had seen a lot in life. "You look different," she said. "I don't know what it is, but there's something different about you." And then I told her everything. I told her about Bryce, about the money, about the betrayal, about everything I had discovered. I talked for almost an hour without stopping, and she listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally with an expression that mixed sadness with something that seemed like recognition. When I finished, she sighed deeply. "Ellie, I knew something wasn't right. I saw it every Friday when he came over, the way he treated you like you were a service. But I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place. But I'm glad you're finally seeing the truth." She took my hand, her fingers cool but her grip firm. "I need to ask you a favor," I said. "I need you to be my witness. I need that if Bryce comes and tries to say that I'm confused, that I'm senile, you can confirm that's not true, that I'm in full possession of my faculties." She nodded without hesitation. "Of course, and more than that, if you need a place to stay, if you ever don't feel safe in your house, my door is open." Those words filled me with such deep gratitude that they almost made me cry, but I didn't cry. I had cried enough. Now it was time to act. That night, back in my house, I organized all the documents I had collected. I put them in a large folder. I made copies of everything, stored the originals in a safe place, and left the copies in the folder. If something happened to me, if Bryce tried to do anything, there would be evidence. There would be proof. I also wrote a letter detailing everything I had discovered, everything Bryce had done. I put it in a sealed envelope with instructions that it should only be opened in case of emergency. I gave it to Mrs. Bertha to hold on to. I was preparing myself like a general preparing for battle because I knew Bryce wasn't going to let this go. I knew he would come, that he would try to manipulate me, to convince me, to make me doubt myself. But I was no longer the same woman I had been 2 weeks ago. That woman had died the night Bryce threatened me in my own kitchen. The woman I was now was different. She was stronger, clearer, more determined. On Wednesday afternoon, as I was making tea, I heard a car stop in front of my building. I looked out the window and saw Bryce's car. He got out, along with his wife. They looked determined. They were coming to confront me. I took a deep breath, put away my cup of tea and waited. The doorbell rang once, twice, 3 times, each time more insistent. I opened the door, but didn't invite them in. I stood on the threshold, blocking the entrance. "We need to talk," Bryce said. His voice was hard, with no pretense of kindness. "I'm listening," I told him. "Inside, Mom. We're not going to talk in the hallway. We don't have anything to talk about inside. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." His wife scoffed. "This is ridiculous, Ellie. Stop acting like we're enemies." You are enemies, I replied. Enemies are honest about their hostility. You're worse. You're thieves hiding behind pretty words. Bryce took a step toward me, his face red with fury. How dare you? After everything I've done for you. Everything you've done to me, Bryce. I have the records. I have the proof. I know exactly how much money you've stolen from me. I know about the fraudulent credit cards. I know about the utility account. I know about everything. He froze, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. And now, I continued with a calmness that surprised even myself, you have two options. Either you give me back everything you stole, every single cent, or I go to the police and press charges for fraud. You can't do that, his wife said. He's your son. Precisely why it hurts so much, I replied. Because he is my son, because I gave him everything, and he repaid me by robbing me. Bryce finally found his voice. You owe me, he shouted. My whole life I grew up without a father. My whole life I had to watch you work and be tired. That was your fault. You chose to have me. You chose to stay alone. I didn't ask to be born. His words landed like punches, but they no longer hurt the way they used to because now I could see them for what they were. Justifications, excuses from someone who knew he had done something unforgivable, and was trying to shift the blame. You're right, I told him. I chose to have you and it was the best decision of my life, until it stopped being the best. But that doesn't give you the right to steal from me. That doesn't give you the right to exploit me. I didn't steal anything. I just took what was owed to me. Nothing was owed to you, Bryce. I gave you everything you needed when you were a child. Once you became an adult, it was no longer my obligation. And it was definitely not my obligation to give you access to my money without my knowledge. His wife grabbed his arm. Let's go. It's not worth it. She's already lost. Lost? What an interesting choice of words. As if I were the one who was in the wrong. As if defending my own money and dignity were madness. They left then, walking down the stairs without looking back. And I closed the door, feeling strangely at peace. That night David Chung called me. He told me that the banks had confirmed the fraud, that the credit card debt would be canceled, that they were investigating the unauthorized withdrawals, and that I had a solid case if I chose to press criminal charges. I thanked him and hung up. I sat in my empty living room, in my house that no longer had a television or fancy furniture. And for the first time in a long time I felt rich in something that money couldn't buy, rich in dignity and strength, in the certainty that I was doing the right thing. The days that followed that confrontation at my door were strangely silent, as if the whole world were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I found myself caught in a kind of emotional limbo, where rage and pain mixed with a growing sense of liberation that I didn't know how to fully process. Bryce didn't call again. He didn't show up at my door again. And for the first time in years I wasn't constantly waiting for him to contact me. I wasn't checking my phone every hour to see if there was a message from him. I wasn't inventing excuses in my mind to justify his absence or his silence. But even though he wasn't physically present in my life during those days, his digital presence was impossible to ignore. Something in me led me to check his social media, something I normally wouldn't do as it always seemed like an invasion of privacy, even for a mother. But now, I felt I had the right to know what he was doing, what he was saying, how he was presenting his life to the world while I dealt with the consequences of his actions in private. What I found took my breath away with its audacity, its absolute disconnection between reality and the image he was projecting outward. He had posted a photo the day after our confrontation, a photo of him and his wife at a fancy restaurant, smiling at the camera with glasses of wine in their hands. The caption said something about celebrating the release of toxic energy and surrounding oneself only with people who add value to life, as if I were the toxicity he needed to liberate himself from, as if my refusal to let myself be robbed further was some kind of negativity he had the wisdom to eliminate from his existence. The comments below the photo were all positive, all congratulating him for protecting his peace of mind, for setting healthy boundaries, for prioritizing his emotional well-being. I stared at the screen feeling a mix of disbelief and disgust, because all those people supporting him had no idea that the man they were celebrating had been robbing his own mother for years. There were more posts in the following days, each one more elaborate than the last, as if Bryce was deliberately constructing a public narrative of his life that had absolutely nothing to do with the truth. I saw a photo of him at the gym with a reflection on self-care and the importance of investing in oneself before being able to help others, words that sounded deep and meaningful until you remembered that this was the same man who had used stolen money from his mother to buy gym memberships and expensive sportswear. There was another photo of him working on his computer with a comment about the sacrifice and hard work it takes to build a successful future, without mentioning that this future had been partially financed with fraudulent credit cards in my name and utility accounts that I knew nothing about. I was unknowingly paying for. What really hit me hard was a post he put up that Friday, the very day he usually came over for dinner. It was an old photo of him and me when he was a kid, a picture I didn't even know existed. I was holding him when he was maybe 5 years old and we were both beaming. The caption talked about how the people you love the most can sometimes be the ones who hurt you the worst. How he'd learned that love doesn't mean putting up with abusive behavior. How he'd made the tough choice to distance himself from a toxic family situation for his own mental health. Reading those words felt like a punch to the gut. Bryce had taken our history, our actual relationship with all its messy and painful details, and completely flipped it around. He was playing the victim and I was the abuser. The comments on that post exploded even more than before. Dozens of people were sending their support, telling him how brave he was for setting those boundaries, and sharing their own stories about tough family situations. They were completely backing up his made-up version of events. And I knew some of those people in the comments. Neighbors who knew him when he lived with me. Coworkers who'd been to parties at my place years ago. They were all offering words of encouragement and support, not even realizing that the person he supposedly needed protection from was the same woman who'd worked 2 jobs for years so he could get the education that now got him his high-paying job. For days I just watched this whole thing play out online, not saying a word, not reacting in public at all. Something inside me knew that this was exactly the game Bryce was playing. If I got emotional and responded, I'd be walking right into his trap. It would just give him more stuff to use in his story about me being the unstable, problematic mother he needed to get away from. But every new post, every new comment of support from people who didn't know the real story, felt like a little cut opening up inside me. It wasn't that I cared what those people thought of me specifically. It was more that it hurt to see how easily people bought into a well-told story without even thinking about whether there might be another side to things. The last straw came when Bryce posted a story showing off the house he and his wife had bought. He was showing off the renovations they'd done, the new furniture they'd gotten, the perfectly designed garden. He presented it all as the result of their hard work and dedication. Not once did he mention that a big chunk of it was paid for with money that wasn't his, with credit that had been taken out fraudulently using my personal info. He showed it all off with so much pride, so much satisfaction, like he really thought he'd earned it all himself. Like he'd completely forgotten or just didn't care that every brick in that house was partly built on the sacrifices and theft from his own mother. I watched him living his life through those little digital windows, and wondered how someone could sleep at night knowing what they'd done. How could he keep up this act of being a successful, ethical person while also committing fraud and theft against the person who gave him life? Did he ever feel guilty? Did he ever stop for a second during one of those fancy dinners or expensive gym workouts and think about his mother sitting alone in an empty house after having sold her furniture just to eat because her own son had been systematically robbing her for years? But looking at his posts, seeing how easily he built and maintained this perfect public image, I started to understand something fundamental about Bryce. Something I might have always known deep down but never wanted to fully admit. My son had developed the ability to create completely separate realities in his mind. In one reality, he could be both the abandoned son who deserved to be compensated and the successful man who'd built everything himself. In another, he could justify theft as something he was rightfully owed, while publicly playing the victim of a toxic family. It was a level of cognitive dissonance that was so extreme it almost seemed like he really believed his own lies. Like he'd built such an elaborate story in his head that the line between what was real and what was made up had completely disappeared. And as I watched all this from the quiet distance of my empty house, something inside me got even harder than it already was. Seeing Bryce not only steal from me but also steal my story, completely reversing the roles of victim and offender in his public version of events, made me realize that there was no way to fix this. There was no conversation I could have that would make him see the truth of what he'd done. He'd made his choice. He'd chosen the lie over the truth. He'd chosen image over substance. And I had to accept that the son I'd raised and loved had either never really existed the way I thought he did, or had been completely replaced by this stranger who could smile for the camera while secretly destroying his mother, and apparently not feel a shred of guilt. The moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in a way I hadn't planned, but looking back, I realized it had been inevitable from the start. Because the truth always comes out, no matter how many lies you pile on top of it to try and keep it hidden. I was in Otten Chong's office going over the final case documents. He told me the banks had finished their investigations and confirmed a total of $17,000 in fraudulent charges over 3 years. That number just took my breath away, not so much because of the amount itself, but because of what it meant in terms of planning and intent. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a carefully planned and executed act of theft that Bryce had to work at constantly. The lawyer said that with this evidence, I had more than enough to file criminal charges. But he also said there was another option I might want to think about before making that final decision. That option was to send a formal demand letter to Bryce, giving him a chance to return the stolen money and make up for the damages before taking more serious legal action. He said a lot of victims of family fraud offer this as a courtesy because they understand that no matter how bad the crime, there are still family ties that make the situation different from fraud committed by strangers. But he also warned me that Bryce could see this as a sign of weakness. I had to be ready for the possibility that he wouldn't respond with gratitude or remorse, but with more manipulation and denial. I thought about it for several minutes, sitting in the lawyer's office and looking at all the documents spread out on the desk. They meticulously detailed every fraudulent charge, every unauthorized account, every lie my son had carefully built up over the years. I realized that a part of me still had a small irrational hope that if Bryce was faced with the undeniable proof of what he'd done, maybe something in him would wake up. Maybe he'd find some trace of a conscience or remorse, or at least admit that he'd crossed a line he shouldn't have crossed. That part of me that was still his mother despite everything, wanted to give him that chance to do the right thing, to fix his mistake, to show that somewhere deep down the person I'd raised with so much love and sacrifice still existed. But there was another part of me, stronger and clearer, that knew exactly what Bryce would do with that chance. And that part knew he wouldn't see it as an act of grace, but as proof that I was too weak to really hurt him. That he could keep manipulating and controlling me because at the end of the day I'd always give in because I was his mother, and mothers always forgive, always give another chance, always choose love over justice. That part of me understood that giving him a private warning would only give him time to get his defense ready, hide more evidence, and build an even more elaborate story about how he was the victim. He could use that to publicly destroy my reputation before I could do anything. I told Aaron Chong that I didn't want to send a private letter. I didn't want to give Bryce the chance to respond in private, where he could keep controlling the story and manipulating the situation to his advantage. Instead, I asked him to prepare the documents to file a formal civil lawsuit that would be a public record. That way, anyone who wanted to know the truth could find it instead of just believing the version of events Bryce had been so carefully creating on social media. The lawyer nodded, looking a little surprised and maybe even a little impressed. He probably didn't expect a woman my age to make such a clear and direct decision. He said he'd get started on the paperwork right away, and that Bryce would be officially notified within 72 hours. I left that office feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on at first, until I realized it was power. The power of making a decision completely on my own, without asking anyone's advice, without asking permission, without worrying about how it would look to other people or whether they'd think I was being too hard on my own son. For the first time in decades, I'd chosen to protect myself instead of protecting someone else's feelings or reputation, even when that person was my son. And that choice, even though it was painful, gave me a sense of integrity I'd forgotten I could feel. Audie Chung confirmed by phone that Bryce got the notification on Thursday morning. Even though I wasn't there to see his first reaction, I could perfectly picture the moment he opened that official envelope and read the documents listing every fraudulent transaction, every unauthorized account, every dollar he'd stolen. It was all meticulously documented with dates and bank reference numbers that made it impossible for him to deny anything. I didn't have to wait long to find out if I was right. Less than 2 hours after he got the notification, my phone started ringing and wouldn't stop. It was Bryce calling over and over. I let it go to voicemail every time because I had nothing left to say to him that wasn't already in those legal documents. I listened to the voicemails later that night when I finally felt emotionally ready. It was fascinating in a disturbing way to hear how his panic grew with each message. In the first one, he was still trying to stay calm, using that controlled voice he used when he wanted to seem reasonable. He said it was all a terrible misunderstanding, and that we needed to talk right away before things got even more out of control. The second message was different. It was sharper, more urgent. He begged me to call him, saying this was going to ruin his life, and that I should please think about what I was doing before destroying my own son. It was like I was the one destroying something instead of just revealing the destruction he himself had caused for years. By the fifth message, Bryce wasn't even trying to sound reasonable or appeal to my maternal feelings anymore. He'd completely lost it and was making barely hidden threats. He said I was going to regret this, that he had his own lawyers who would prove I was a senile old woman who didn't know what I was doing. He was going to fight this with everything he had, and in the end I was going to be the villain in this story. I listened to every message all the way through without letting myself feel anything more than a kind of clinical curiosity about how someone could go from pleading to threatening so quickly when they realized their usual tricks weren't working anymore. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal and emotional stuff. Bryce didn't just sit there. He started his own counterattack, beginning with a long detailed statement on social media about how he was being victimized by a terrible injustice. He said it was being done by a mother he supposedly loved, but who was now attacking him legally for reasons he couldn't fully understand. His post was carefully worded to get as much sympathy as possible without mentioning any specific details about the accusations against him. He painted himself as the confused and hurt son who was being dragged through a traumatic legal process by a mother who might be having age-related mental health problems. The response to his post was exactly what he wanted. Dozens of people commented, expressing shock and support, telling him to keep his head up, that the truth would come out in the end, and that they were on his side no matter what. I watched all this from a distance, feeling a mix of amazement and disgust at his ability to manipulate the situation, even when he was facing documented legal charges. But something had changed in me. This time his public performance didn't affect me the way it had before. This time I knew I had something more powerful than his carefully chosen words. And that something was undeniable legal documents that couldn't be twisted with emotional language or appeals to sympathy. Bryce's life really started to fall apart when his own lawyers looked at the evidence against him, and apparently told him something he didn't want to hear. His social media posts just stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was incredibly telling. Adong Woo Chong told me that Bryce's lawyers had contacted him, asking about the possibility of settling out of court. That basically confirmed that they knew he had no real defense against the evidence I presented, and that his best bet was to try and minimize the damage before it went to a public trial where all the nasty details would be made public. That's when the cracks in Bryce's carefully built life started to show. Apparently, some of his closest friends had started asking awkward questions after his wife mentioned at a party that they were dealing with a complicated family legal issue. Once people started digging a little, they found the public lawsuit documents that spelled out the specific accusations of financial fraud. Mrs. Bertha told me she'd heard from other neighbors that Bryce's name was being talked about in neighborhood conversations in ways that weren't exactly flattering. The people who'd once seen him as the successful, well-educated son now looked at him with suspicion and distrust. His wife was supposedly furious, not necessarily because of the moral implications of what Bryce had done, but because of the damage to their social standing. According to gossip going around the neighborhood, there had been some pretty big fights at their house about how to handle the situation. Bryce tried to call me several more times during those weeks, but I stayed completely silent because there was nothing he could say to change the documented facts of what he'd done. And my silence was apparently more devastating to him than any angry words I could have said because it meant I'd gone from anger to indifference. And that indifference was the final death of any power he'd ever had over me. The final settlement was reached 3 months after I filed the lawsuit, and the terms were exactly what Admiral Chung and I had set as the minimum acceptable. Bryce had no choice but to agree when his own lawyers explained that going to trial would mean not only making all the details of the fraud public, but also the very real chance of criminal charges that could send him to jail. He had to pay back the full $17,000, plus another $5,000 to cover damages and harm. On top of that, he had to pay all the fees for fixing my credit and my attorney's fees. And all of this had to be paid within 6 months with verifiable monthly payments, or the agreement would automatically be canceled, and criminal charges would be filed without any more warning. But more than the money, which honestly had never been the main point of all this, the agreement included a clause that I'd insisted on adding. Admiral Chung didn't think it was necessary at first, but for me it was absolutely essential. That clause said that Bryce had to issue a public statement admitting that he'd committed financial fraud against his mother, and that the accusations in my lawsuit were true and supported by evidence. He fought that clause harder than anything else in the agreement because he knew exactly what it would mean for his carefully crafted image to publicly admit that everything he'd been saying about being a victim of a toxic mother was a lie he'd made up to cover up his own crimes. The statement appeared on his social media on a Tuesday afternoon. It was short and clearly written by his lawyers to minimize the damage as much as possible, while still meeting the requirements of the agreement. But still, the words were there in black and white, admitting that he'd accessed bank accounts without permission, that he'd opened credit cards using someone else's information, and that he'd made serious errors in judgment that he deeply regretted. The comments under that post were crazy. People who'd previously supported him without question were now expressing shock and disappointment, while others who'd apparently suspected something all along felt like their doubts had been confirmed. I watched all that drama play out online, feeling a sense of closure that had nothing to do with happiness or revenge. It was just a quiet feeling that the truth had finally been made public. The first payment showed up in my account exactly on the date it was supposed to, and every payment after that also arrived on time. Bryce knew that even one missed payment would mean consequences he definitely couldn't afford. With that money, I did something he probably never expected. Instead of just putting it back in my savings account or using it to replace the furniture I'd sold, I bought a plane ticket to a place I'd never been before. I'd spent 62 years living for other people, for my son, for the idea of keeping up a family relationship that only existed in my head. And now, for the first time in my adult life, I had the freedom and the money to live exactly the way I wanted without having to explain my choices to anyone. I bought a small house in a coastal town about 3 hours from where I'd lived my whole life. It had 2 bedrooms and a garden where I could finally plant the flowers I'd always wanted but never had time to take care of when I was working 2 jobs. The house cost $200,000, which I paid for in cash using a combination of Bryce's payments and the savings I'd managed to protect in my new bank account. When I signed the papers, I felt something I can only describe as a rebirth because this house was mine in a way that no other place had ever been mine before. I bought it with money that had been returned through justice, not earned through endless sacrifice. Bryce tried to contact me one last time after he'd made the final payment and completely met the terms of the agreement. This time I answered the phone because I knew there was nothing left he could take from me or use against me. His voice sounded different, smaller, more humble. When he asked if we could ever really talk, if there was ever a chance of some kind of reconciliation, I listened to his question in silence before answering with words I'd been preparing in my mind for months. I told him that the son I raised either never really existed or died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone I didn't know and didn't want to know. I told him that while I wished him peace and growth in his life, that peace and growth would have to happen far away from me because I'd closed that door. Not out of hatred, but out of self-love. There was a long silence after I spoke, And then a sound that might have been a sob or just ragged breathing before he hung up without saying anything else. And that was the last time I spoke to Bryce, because some doors once closed need to stay closed, not as a punishment but as a form of protection. Now I live in my small house by the sea, and I spend my mornings drinking coffee in my garden, watching the flowers I planted with my own hands grow. There's a peace in this simple life that I never found in all those years of sacrifice and giving, because I finally understood that true love starts with yourself, and that no relationship is worth keeping if it means you have to betray your own dignity. Sometimes Mrs. Bertha comes to visit me every few weeks, bringing gossip from the old neighborhood and news about people we used to know. And she tells me I look different now, lighter, more alive in ways that go beyond just physical appearance. I have a routine now that's completely my own. I wake up when my body wants to wake up, not when an alarm clock forces me to. I cook meals that I like, not worrying about what someone else wants to eat. I spend my afternoons reading books I always wanted to read but never had time for. And in the evenings I sit on my small porch, listening to the distant sound of the waves and feeling deeply grateful. Not for what I have in terms of things, but for what I finally understand about my own worth. This is my victory. Not in getting the money back or in Bryce's public admission, but in the fact that I saved myself from decades of being taught that a mother's value is only measured by how much she can give and how much she can put up with. I learned that saying no is an act of self-love, that setting boundaries isn't being cruel, but is a necessity, and that protecting your peace isn't selfish, it's just smart. And now I live every day as proof of those lessons. I learned them too late, but not too late to matter. I closed that door on Bryce, not out of revenge, but out of respect for myself. And that difference changes everything, because it means I won not by. Making him my enemy wasn't my intention at all. It just happened because I refused to keep letting myself be victimized. So, did you enjoy hearing my story? And I'm curious, what city are you tuning in from? I'd love for us to connect in the comments section down below. If you were captivated by the story I shared, you can show your support by sending a super thanks. That really helps me to keep creating and sharing more stories just like this one. Thank you so very much for your incredibly kind support. I'm really looking forward to reading all of your comments and thoughts on the story. Right now on the screen in front of you, you'll see 2 brand new life stories that I think you'll absolutely love, and that I highly recommend you check out. There's so much more content available on my channel, so be sure to explore. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything. I'll see you in the next life story. Sending you all my love and respect.